Okay, so this brings us to our last session of the day, which is actually listed as an oceanside chat, and only for, it would take too long. I think it would be fabulous to go down to the boardwalk and sit by the ocean and have this chat, but nonetheless, I want to introduce Dr. Chris Huskelson. Chris is a pioneer in the energy sector in Canada and internationally. During his appointment as the president and CEO of Emera Inc., the company more than doubled its assets to over $9 billion. Under his leadership, Emera expanded its operations and services and infrastructure in the northeastern U.S., Atlantic Canada, St. Lucia, Grand Bahama, and Barbados. Chris has led capital and service-based initiatives such as pump storage hydroelectric facilities, natural gas pipelines, gas-fired power plants, energy services companies, renewable tidal energy companies. He's involved in the Maritime Link, bringing clean energy to Nova Scotia, and we could go on. And despite all of that, I met Chris in a bit of a different context while he was still at Emera, but Chris was a thought leader and founding supporter of the Emera Idea Hub, which you've heard from two of the companies, CAE and GIT were both, well, CAE still is, but GIT was a former member of the Idea Hub. And I think Chris has also been both in New Brunswick and in Nova Scotia, not just a strong supporter, but a player in entrepreneurship, helping startup companies in many sectors. And I know he's still doing that and still incredibly active and, you know, part of the larger ecosystem here in Atlantic Canada. So we're thrilled to have Chris with us to wrap this up. And Chris, I don't know if you wanted to say a few words before we have a few questions or how you want to do this.
I think we can. The one thing I got to say is that we actually tenfold Emera.
So tenfold.
So we went from 3 billion to 30 billion. So.
Oh, okay. I must have old notes. This must have been like.
So I can't let that pass. But no, I think this was an interesting discussion today, and I think you know, it should open up more discussion over time. You know, and I think, you know, one of the things I think is pretty clear from what has been discussed today is that there's an awful lot of really interesting activity. And the difference, I think, between, maybe I'll just stand up a bit. The difference between what I think what has gone on here and what is now going on here is that we're actually really focused on commercialization. And so we're moving from just doing a lot of very interesting things to actually turning that into value. And so when I think about that value, I just take one example, and that's the Creative Destruction Lab cohort in Oceans. And over the past 3 years, just 3 years, we've created companies that actually have gone to $500 million worth of value in 3 years. And so that's the kind of thing that is the opportunity here in this market and is here in the oceans. As you heard today, just a tremendous amount of activity. The one other thing that I would also kind of focus on as a starting point is that on the one hand, and Jim will tell you this, the ocean is tough. It's a really tough thing to work in. And in large part, that's because it's really a hardware business more than anything else, and hardware is always tough. But the other piece of it that I don't think people really understand is that the application of existing technologies to the ocean is very doable. And most of what's actually going on is taking things that work really well on land and adapting them to the ocean. And that makes it a lot easier than it might otherwise be. And so, you know, that's another thing that we've experienced, we've seen, and is now turning into, again, a lot of commercialized value. So maybe with that, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So we've heard a lot today about Halifax and Atlantic Canada and sort of the ecosystem that's thriving here, both for people listening online and people here, and really anybody looking at this ocean tech sector and the opportunities. What's your advice to help them sort of get into this and realize the opportunities?
Well, I think first of all, the opportunity is there. There's no question about that. And again, the amount of activity that's gone on in this market, and frankly, across Canada, especially, adding BC into that, we've seen an awful lot. I think the greatest opportunity that Canada has actually comes from two things that two people said. So I take, first of all, Chris Gugu's presentation. And, in large part, what Chris said was just do it. There are lots of things we can do, and the Mi'kmaq community has actually started doing things, and all of a sudden that's turned into value for them. So we've hesitated, I think, to do the things that we could do. And so I think just doing it is a critical piece. And then the second opportunity for Canada is really get the regulatory right. I mean, we've been building USVs now for the past 4 years. And interestingly, what actually, and most of that has been happening either in Canada or in the UK, or actually in Ireland. But what really threw a wrench into that activity was when the Mayflower started operating in UK waters. And the Mayflower didn't pay a lot of attention to what the Marine Coastal Authority wanted them to pay attention to. And all of a sudden, the MCA in the UK shut down approvals of USVs, just that easily. And so things like figuring out how to make an uncrewed surface vessel work, how to do that in such a way that regulations actually can approve it as opposed to disapprove of it, and moving further and further towards automation. It's a tremendous opportunity, but Canada needs to get regulation right. And I would say that Transport Canada has been doing a good job, but they've been spending a lot of time trying to figure out what it should look like. And so the more we can get definition to what it looks like. So again, doing things and getting regulation right is really where the opportunity is, I think, right now.
Good, thank you. I do want to give a chance if anybody in the audience wants to put up their hand and ask a question, please go ahead. This is kind of an open discussion. So actually,
Jim always has questions.
You mentioned data. You mentioned the longest time I've heard that the future of the ocean is blue ocean. Just reflect on that because it seems.
Yeah, I think, Jim, people dream that the value is in the data, but people still haven't really figured out what to do with that data. So if I just take one of the companies I'm involved in, which is X-Ocean, they now have 45,000 hours of operation and collecting probably a terabyte of data every 8 hours. So think about how much data that is. But at this 10 seconds, they haven't figured out how they can actually commercialize that data. They certainly sell it to the customers that they do the initial work for, but they collect a tremendous amount of additional data, and figuring out how to do that is still very difficult. So I think it's about hardware first, and we've got to get the hardware out there. We've got to get the regulatory environment such that we can get the hardware out there, and we've got to do more and more uncrewed, automated, all those kinds of things, so that we become more and more effective and efficient. But we still have to keep thinking about where the data can go, and I think we just don't know yet. So that's why I say it's hardware now, and really keep focusing on hardware, because that's going to lead to more opportunity down the road.
I think it was Wendy this morning who was talking about the fact that the ocean economy is still such a small part of the Canadian economy. Yet, when you read some of the reports, and actually somebody, I can't remember, alluded to it as well this afternoon, about the global economy by 2030 doubling or more in the ocean economy sector. So do you think Canada has the ability to kind of really grow its economy in the ocean sector?
Well, absolutely, I do. And I mean, I think if you do the comparison between Canada and Norway, that's the really interesting comparison. So today we do somewhere between 25 and 32 billion in the ocean economy today. Norway does 7 times that, so something closer to 200 billion. And so if we just simply did as much activity as Norway is doing, that would actually take us to a much bigger number. And with the coastline we have and the opportunities we have, we should be able to get to 10% of our economy, which is about 200 billion as well. So, I mean, I think the numbers are really, really strong. But again, I think it's critically important that we continue to focus on commercialization. I think the work that's happening at the supercluster is a big part of that. I think the work that's happening in the Creative Destruction Lab and other startup activities. The other thing that I think is very, very important is to start, you know, everybody talks about SMEs. I don't like talking about small and medium-sized enterprises. I like talking about innovation-driven enterprises. And I think if we can start converting our existing SMEs that have lots of technical capability into innovation-driven enterprises, then we can start to see that kind of multiplication of the ocean economy here. And I mean, we're actually starting to go down that path, but we're very, very slow.
Just checking. We had a number of talks that were talking about offshore oil and gas and whatnot, but we didn't talk a lot today about tidal energy or even offshore wind energy. I wonder if you have thoughts on the potential of those sectors. Well, I know you have thoughts on the potential of those sectors.
As you know from my work on the Maritime Link, I think Eastern Hydro comes first. So I do think we've got to make sure that we utilize all the onshore energy sources that we have, and that will help really strengthen our economy. So that's an important thing. I think we have so much onshore. I mean, if you think about it, you know, we keep complaining about our energy system in Canada, but only 20% of electricity in Canada is generated from fossil fuels. So we already have, if not one of the cleanest electricity systems in the world. And so it is an incremental thing that we would do to get there. If you think about tidal energy, it's not an engineering problem, it's a finance problem, and it's a finance problem simply because electricity in Canada is so cheap. It's hard to get to that cost. I do think it's an interesting engineering problem, and I've been at tidal energy since 1980, so no successes yet. But I mean, I think it's a finance problem, not an engineering problem.
Checking just in case anybody has a question. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, and maybe just a quick introduction, and then my question is maybe a bit thought-provoking. I'm coming from actually London, Ontario, so I come here. I got up 3 a.m. to come to the conference from Toronto, so really learned a lot. And John and I, we knew each other for the last almost 10 years because I was involved in ballast water treatment for about 10 years, and that's a really interesting lesson learned moving from kind of a non kind of ocean related business, because I was with a company doing water treatment. Obviously, treating ballast water was a huge, you know, challenge, opportunity as well, and so on. Learn a lot. And my question and thought is, coming from Ontario, and I had some little exposure to what's going on here on the East Coast, other than the ballast water experience I had before the pandemic. So here, really learn the supercluster, learn all the ecosystem and so on. Are we missing some opportunities in terms of harmonizing or harvesting the resources in Canada? In Canada, we're not a big country. And then I'm pretty involved in the clean tech sector in Ontario with startups and different. It's a very interesting space. And here, I'm just learning. So what's your thoughts around kind of I guess, try to achieve more synergy across the country in terms of resources, expertise, but also interesting the business model side, how we can learn from each other across the country?
Well, I should probably throw this to Susan because, you know, that was the foundational thought process for the supercluster. And it was interesting, you know, we got in a relatively small room and had a relatively focused discussion about possibly applying to the federal government for a supercluster. And, you know, ocean was something that was really just identified as an opportunity for the region. Interestingly, it's probably been a big focus for a long time, but just identified as a really big opportunity. And so a number of different people running businesses in very different sectors, fishery, energy, and oil and gas, non-oil energy, got in a room and started talking about their problems. And interestingly, the cross-sectoral problems and the solutions that were coming, one solution that was working for the fishery would also work for offshore energy. And so when we realized that we were all solving the same problems independently, then pulling together in a supercluster made a lot of sense. And so we actually ingrained in the rules of the supercluster that you must have cross-sectoral, cross-company activity in order for you to get a project approved. So we did learn that. Certainly the supercluster has done a lot of work on the West Coast, developing relationships. I think there are some people from Central Canada as well too, probably not as many. But the other thing, so I was in the clean energy business, and my focus was actually not ocean. It was actually freshwater. But I also recognized that the solutions for the ocean work very well in freshwater as well. So to me, the Great Lakes actually have very similar challenges and synergies as the ocean. And so I do think that there's quite a bit of opportunity there. And I do think, I don't know, Susan, whether you want to make a comment. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe just a bit of a pile-on comment more than anything else. We, agree with everything Chris said. It was like once you got people in a room, it's a little bit like being on a blind date, right? You come in, you're staring at the other person, wondering what you've got in common. But at the end of the day, you're actually trying to sort through and prioritize what you have in common to talk about. That's the situation you typically find yourselves in those types of scenarios. And one of the most interesting sort of observations I had the chance to see during my tenure at OSC was the applicability of these concepts towards sustainable solutions and sustainable business cases. Within the time frame of about 18 months, because we had so much activity initiating at the same time right across the country, you could literally almost watch the industry transform towards sustainable solutions. And collaborative conversations are the types of, they're complicated projects at the end of the day. Sustainable solutions are complicated projects to deliver. And so they're fundamentally in alignment with these types of collaborative conversations. So they generally come hand in hand with each other. You can't have one without the other.
And just going back to my initial comment, we just have to do it. I don't know how many different fish companies talked about doing what CAE is doing, but many of them talked about that, but they couldn't get organized enough to get going on it, whereas CAE just is doing it. And you can really see the difference when that actually happens. And so far, very successful. We'll see what happens when it gets in the ocean, but looks good in the tank.
So Chris, unlike a lot of conferences, we haven't had a lot of university presentations and a lot of talk about the university, but I know, we have colleagues here from Memorial, obviously, but also from Queen's and Waterloo and UVic. And so I wonder if you might comment on what is the role you see universities playing in the ocean economy, and how might that role be different than sort of the traditional research role that universities have played in the past?
Yeah, and I think it's more than just the ocean economy, John. I think the universities are actually critical to our general economies. So I actually joined the board of DAL for a relatively brief period of time, but anyway, a few years ago. And one of the things that I observed was that it was hard for the general public to see DAL as being relevant. And so, yes, they provide education and so on, but how do you really attract government's attention? Because government is really funding the organization. And the way you really do is actually take what you're doing in the university and move it into commercial output and really help the economy. And so we wouldn't have the startup ecosystem we have here today had the leadership of Dalhousie not decided to help. and in fact to lead. And so I think that it's, you know, the universities are critical to our success as a country. And if you take it to the ocean economy, Dalhousie, Memorial, they're both extremely involved in the ocean supercluster. They're extremely involved in what's going on in innovation, and that's the only way it's happening. Critical.
Excellent. One last chance. Yes, please go ahead. Well, more than one last chance, actually, if there's more than one question.
Thank you very much. I didn't want to miss this last chance. I'm from the University of Ottawa, and I'm one of the collaborators of the team of Dave Morin. And since we're talking about the university, one of the questions that I had, and maybe it's related to some of the presentations where there was a significant ask for people who work in the field of coastal and ocean engineering and that have expertise. And I noticed that several of your speakers said we don't have sufficient people. I gave a presentation to the Faculty of Engineering about a month ago on coastal engineering, and I've done a bit of research, and I noticed that Canada has about 243,000 kilometers, right, of coastline. Netherlands has 450 kilometers of coastline. In Netherlands, they have about 136 assistant professors, associate professors, full professors. In Canada, we're 7 coastal engineering professors across the country. So the question, obviously, I get a lot of asks from, including from NRC, OCRE team, of supplying, for example, students that will work over the summer, students that are graduates with a degree, PhDs or masters. But it's very hard for us to supply the numbers to given the market because we're simply limited. And I liked your point, and maybe we're not too good at advertising ourselves to the leadership of the university in terms of getting more positions, for instance. But I find it odd that we have such a limited number of people working in ocean engineering and coastal engineering in Canada, given the potential of the market.
Well, and I think the other thing is, you know, if you think about the amount of time and effort that's spent trying to figure out what we're going to do about global warming, and how little time and effort is spent on figuring out how to adapt, because at the end of the day, you know, we're going to have to adapt. And I think that that's the biggest case, is that adaptation is going to be a critical thing, and we need to have knowledge in order to be able to appropriately adapt. So to me, I'd be making that pitch if I were you.
Thank you.
I have 2 proposals on my desk for hiring coastal engineers, so we're working on it. Josh, yes, please.
So you started talking about the role of the regulators in this, and certainly, you know, I started my career working on medical devices, which is highly regulated and an incredibly difficult area for a startup to be in. You spent a lot of your career in a highly regulated industry. Where do you see the regulation in Canada around sort of the oceans in general? What level of regulation is there, and how?
I think it was, I can't remember which speaker it was, but somebody was talking about you know, I think oil spills. So it was, yeah. So it was a DFO person. But the reality of the situation is that we have a lot more restrictive regulations in this country than they do in most parts of the world. Even Europe, you can do more things in Europe without too much red tape than you can here. So, you know, clearly we have to think about regulation as a competitive advantage and work in that direction. So to me, it starts with, we have to get the political will, we have to get the community's permission, we have to do all that work. And to your point, I mean, I actually built a pipeline through the center of St. John, New Brunswick, right through their most favorite park. But we did that by getting all the people on side. So you have to be able to start by making the case, getting people on side and getting permission to do it. But it is something we have to do in this country. We're just overly regulated without the right regulations to actually make a difference. So if I go back to uncrewed surface vessels and automated vessels, we have the opportunity to lead the world in that area if we want to, but we have to have the desire to do so. So it has to go back to, the strategy. The politicians have to be pushing it, and the bureaucracy has to come along. It's a challenge.
We have a question over here, I think. Once we get you guys going, you have lots of questions.
Got to get the rest of the panels back up here.
First of all, this question is a little bit of a follow-up to your comments that you just mentioned, and I've learned a lot here today, a lot of very interesting things that are going on, but I also thought I was probably going to hear things related to, in the not too distant future, Canada's Panama Canal, basically the Northwest Territories opening up for shipping opportunities, and how the blue economy really starts to take off with that challenge. But I'm not hearing, I hear a lot of things that are related to it, but nothing that is sort of specifically being looked at now. And I'm wondering, are there things that you know of that are, is Canada looking at this in a very serious way now, or is it too early? I guess I just was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
I'm going to qualify my my comments by I'm not very informed about that area. What I can tell you though is that I would say we haven't really, and again I would look to Susan to this question. I don't think we've really scratched the surface of transportation as much as we could in the supercluster activity and in the overall activity we have going here. Things like the coatings that GIT are doing is probably one of the more significant things. They're doing a fair bit of work kind of on board ships, but not a lot about how do you actually transport goods and that kind of thing. So I think there is opportunity there, and I think it probably is worth spending some time and effort on. What I do know, though, and I know this because of USV activity, is that the Canadian government is starting to survey the North. And so that's almost the first step, is we need to understand what we actually have up there, what it will be like through time, and what the best routes are and so on. So, but that's just in the very, very early stages. So I think it's an opportunity that, and you heard about Irving talking about the AOPS program. Well, those vessels are going to be in the North essentially all the time. There's only one ship operating so far. And so, there will be, I think, 8 of them in total at some point. So we'll have a lot greater presence in that area than we do today. But I think it's a huge opportunity that we're not. Susan has a comment.
Yeah, it's nice you mentioned that. I was not just got back, but recently got back from a trip to Norway. I was over to the Arctic Frontiers Conference, which is up in Tromsø, up in the Arctic. And we had a chance to present and talk a little bit about the supercluster model. We have a number of Arctic focused projects in alternative energy. We've got an interesting project in eDNA, some transportation, some moderate degree of relevance to the Arctic, but there's communication infrastructure is a big problem in the Arctic. So that's a kind of underlying barrier that needs to get resolved. The other part about Arctic focused projects is that they are complicated. They take time to develop. You need to involve and co-create them with Indigenous groups. They need to have their problems defined by the people that live there to, a great degree. And so you need to get some traction with the fundamental practice of collaborating to innovate before really you can have a scalable set of opportunities to develop in the Arctic. And so we've made some progress. We've actually been invited. We're going to be presenting with Norway and with the US at the Arctic Council in October, which is the biggest Arctic conference in the world. And what they want to talk about is the supercluster concept and how some of these are, how some of these practices help facilitate the development of Arctic focused projects. But there's a lot of work left still to do.
Maybe I could just quickly add on to that really quickly. So we work with a lot of icebreakers and that sort of thing, right? So one thing that we're noticing a lot more recently is the Arctic sovereignty issue, as you can imagine, with everything going on in the world. So there are icebreakers that are being developed in the U.S. now. We did all the testing for the the American heavy polar icebreaker, and so there is a lot of activity that you're probably not aware of. That's probably not being advertised, but certainly there is with increased sovereignty interest. There's a lot more work going on, and the next step beyond that will probably be okay. If things are opening up, how do we patrol it? How do we control it? And that sort of thing. So there's a lot of that going on. Yeah.
Unfortunately, the clock is catching up with us as it did in pretty much every session. But Chris, we've heard a lot of information shared here today from many different perspectives. So I'm going to give you the last word to comment on things you've heard today, or even things you haven't heard today, to wrap up this session.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I think what I'm hearing from the discussion today, it can be summed up in one word, and that is that we now have momentum. And I think we have momentum in the right direction. So we are focused on innovation, we are focused on commercialization, and we are creating value. And that's what's going to continue the momentum. So I leave it at that.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Chris, and thank everybody. It's been a fabulous day, and I mean, I know I heard a lot of things and learned a lot of things today, and a lot of notes for following up with quite a few people, as far as everybody else does. I do want to thank and acknowledge Masood Masani, who's been our AV tech for the whole day. I think we would have had some real challenges if we didn't have somebody who understood the systems as Masood did. And thank you again to Marilyn and Teresa Ann and Amanda from my office, who've been quietly helping out there in the corner and making things work, and as well to the staff from the Canadian Academy of Engineering. So with that, I will bring this to a close. Thank you all for coming. Always happy to host people on our campus. The rest of the evening is back at the Westin. If you're not staying at the Westin, the rest of the evening is at the Westin. And we'll see you there later for the reception before the induction ceremony tonight for those who are going. Thank you.